now. But without further ado, let's get started. Um, uh, so again, like this presentation is being put on by the Malaya Movement USA. And the Malaya Movement USA is an organization of US-based Filipinos who are fighting for human rights, democracy, and sovereignty for the Philippines and for the Filipino people. Our organization was actually founded in 2018 in direct response to the drug war that is actually still ongoing, but was started by the previous Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. When we were founded in 2018, we were a loose network of Filipinos across the United States who felt the urgency of gathering Filipinos here in the United States to respond and diplomatically isolate the previous regime in the Philippines. By 2018, actually, the death count under the drug war in the Philippines had reached 27,000. And when Duterte had left office, the death count, by estimates of human rights organizations on the ground, had reached 30,000 people, 30,000 Filipinos who were extrajudicially killed, meaning no trial, no detention or arrests or whatsoever, but just folks being murdered on the street. And again, it's actually still ongoing in the Philippines. And now under the son of the dictator of the Philippines that was ousted by the Filipino people. So since then, the Malaya Movement has launched several campaigns, again, to advance democracy, human rights, and sovereignty in the Philippines. Our campaigns have spanned from, putting up opposition against the drug war, the call to release political prisoners in the Philippines, the fight against disinformation that is cultivated by fascists in the Philippines. And one of our recent campaigns is our Filipinos for Palestine campaign, in genuine solidarity with the Palestinian liberation and struggle for life and liberty, and for national liberation of Palestine. So since then, we've had our organization, again, starting from a loose network, has now grown into an organized movement of at least 18 chapters across the country, where Filipinos, where you can find big populations of Filipinos across the United States, one of which Los Angeles, like what I said, where I am from. And our organization takes inspiration from the anti-dictatorship, anti-martial law movement that was born out of the Ferdinand Marcos Sr. dictatorship. And the movement spanned globally, not just the Philippines, but galvanized a movement right here in the United States. And that is the legacy under which Malaya Movement and anti-fascist Filipinos based in the United States are taking inspiration from and basing our tactics and our lessons from. So very happy that you all are here with us. If you don't know much about the Filipino movement, you'll probably learn the most so far in your activist or your activist journey. So that was a mouthful, but letting y'all know that the organization that is putting up this educational presentation has a lot of experience and a lot of history. So without further ado, let's start. If we could go to the next slide. So these are pretty much the goals of the study. So by the end of this study, which we are slating for 90 minutes, but with questions and Q&As and discussion, some sort of discussion, at least what we can achieve through Zoom. But this is what you can expect at the end of this study and what we want to aim for at the end of this study. So one, for participants here to be able to define the purpose and characteristics of fascism by studying its historical roots and development to present day. Two, we want to help participants be able to identify fascism and discuss examples from the past and now. Three, we want to prepare participants to be able to educate others about fascism. Four, help participants understand historical victories and what lessons to apply from there. Very relevant now. And five, we aim to have participants be able to understand the role that a mass movement plays, the role of people, regular everyday people coming together to get organized and take organized action in building the anti-fascist movement. So you could go to the next slide. But before we begin the study part of this presentation, we want to contextualize things a bit. So of course, it's a deliberate decision that Malaya Movement organized this study following the US presidential elections. As folks know, Trump and the Republican Party had won the White House by a huge margin, both winning the Electoral College and the popular vote. Not only the White House, or not only the executive branch, but if we go to the following slide, next slide, the Republican Party also had won the Senate and, next slide, as well as the House. So right now, the Republican Party under Trump has control of the executive branch, the legislative branch, or majority control, as well as the judicial branch, what with the Republicans packing the court with conservative judges, with every Republican administration, recent Republican administration, most recent of which is Trump, and now again Trump. But something very important that we want to highlight actually as we go into this study, and keep this in mind, if we go to the next slide, is these exit polls of the motivations of voters who voted either for Trump and the Republicans, or Harris and the Democrats. You could actually flash the second slide as well. So for Harris voters, by far the main thing that Harris voters had named as a big concern for them is the state of democracy. Whereas if you go back to the previous slide, for Trump voters, it's the economy. And if folks have seen the demographics of voters who voted for either Trump or Harris, it's actually a mix of things. Usually it's predictable, right? Usually one party gathers an older generation, a more wealthy generation, a wider makeup and population. But this time around, it was actually a mix. But what's really important to just highlight here, and thinking about the historical development of fascism, with Trump voters or conservative voters naming the economy as their main as their main concern. Historically, if we simply study history, economic hardship and decline usually precedes uh, a populist politician that spouts a fascist solution and fascist ideals. So think of a time, Nazi Germany, the easiest one to probably think about. It was preceded by an extreme economic downturn that followed the First World War. So why does this happen? And why is it that fascists like Trump are able to dupe a population into thinking, hey, like vote for me, everything will be good? That's pretty much it. That's the promise. If folks know what Trump's tagline is, I will fix it. I will fix it. And I mean, we are probably all feeling the economic anxiety or economic hardship and just this outrageous wealth gap, not just in the United States, but globally. Here in Los Angeles, we're the Malaya members here. Some of the Malaya members here are part of campaigning against vicious evictions because rent is, or housing in general, the housing crisis is a crisis. It is crisising in Los Angeles and across the country. So unfortunately, Trump was able to speak to voters along the lines of these anxieties, something fundamental of something about their survival. And again, like if folks see the makeup and distribution of who voted for Trump, it's across the board. Now, in terms of the Democrats, if you could just go to the next slide. Not that the next slide really says something about, well, okay, yes. The Democrats weren't able to speak to like a more fundamental concern widely of the general population. Not only that, it is under a Democratic administration that the genocide of Palestine by U.S.-backed Israeli state is happening. This the housing crisis, this crisis of low wages and high prices, it happened under a Democratic administration. Now, what people are doing now is voting for relief. Like if this is not working, then we're going to go to this alternative, even though this alternative is bad, if not worse. Now, I am very much out of time, but before I move forward, so just something to highlight here. We're not saying that either the Republican Party or the Democrats are the solution here, because clearly neither are, and neither are proposing actual solutions to this constant instability and just the ability to instability of folks' ability to survive in this country. So I think like something to think about and move forward with as we go through this study is actually reimagining a different order, even a different economic order, a different political order, where for political order, we don't have to choose between two parties. We don't have to choose between build a wall, deport them, etc., to like, okay, yeah, genocide in Palestine is totally fine. And we hope that when we go into this, we also want folks to reimagine a world or an economic reality where we don't have to rely an economic reality that isn't defined by scarcity, isn't defined by, again, low wages, high prices, or the people's right to survive merely depends on how much you have in the bank. So that's what we want to preface this with. So if we could go to the next slide. A bit of Project 2025. I'm sure folks have already heard about it, but it is a manifesto and political, military, economic platform, what have you, that is attached to the Trump administration. I just want to flash this for a quick bit because as we go into the study, again, we'll find out, and we already understand this to some degree, that fascism is the rolling back of rights. So under Project 2025, it guts many basic rights like healthcare, which abortion acts is healthcare. The activation of the National Guard supposedly to conduct mass deportations, the acceleration of warrantless surveillance, undue force on protesters. We're already seeing that even prior to a Trump administration. Severely limiting voting access, already seeing that prior to a Trump administration. If we go to the next slide. Sorry, that's a repeat of the first one, but censoring critical discussions in classrooms. So really censoring academic freedom and censoring freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of education. And of course, rolling back of the rights of the transgender community. So those are just some of the things that are attached to the Trump agenda or Project 2025. If we go to the next slide. Oh, time's up. Okay. So this is what to expect for the outline. We are going to go through the history of the word fascism. We are going to go through the features of fascism. So by the end of this study, we know what to look out for. We're also going to go through a quick timeline and overview of fascist regimes, very quick. But mainly we're going to go through fascism in the United States, also fascism in the Philippines. Again, this is a study by diasporic Filipinos here in the United States, and of course the people's resistance to fascism. Sorry, this is a little anyway. That's what we can expect today. Go to the next slide, please. And before we dig in, just quick ask to folks. If you are not yet organized, if you want to take action, if you want to take action with your community, you can join the Malaya Movement. Again, we are an organization of Filipinos fighting for human rights, democracy, and sovereignty, and fighting against fascism in the Philippines, and in solidarity of the People's Liberation Movement here as well. So you can join that. And we also have many of our members actually just came back from the Philippines in a fact-finding mission or an investigative mission. And we will be on December 7, we will be having a report back of our findings of the people's resistance back home and the issues that they're facing under the fascist Marcos Jr. regime. Can we go to the next slide? Also, Malaya Movement is purely all voluntary, all volunteers, many hours of educating our community and taking direct action, etc. So please, if you are able, help us out with our operations costs. Again, we're all doing this based on donations. And that is it for my part. I can pass it off for the study to begin to my next facilitator.
All right. Hello, everyone. Oh my God, I feel like we're like a news reporter, but hello, everyone. I'm Mikey. I'm with Malaya, DC. As you can see, I'm outside. Hope everyone's having a great time so far. So we're going to go into just the history of fascism and we're gonna really understand what fascism means. So, as for the term fascism, the first group to adopt this nomenclature was Benito Mussolini's National Fascist Party, or the Partito Nazionale Fascista, along with the other parties inspired by it, such as the Nazi Party. This term itself, it's derived from a Latin term, fascio, which is represented by which means a bundle of sticks, like as you can see with the symbol, with the flag over there. This represents strength in numbers, kind of like how in Planet of the Apes, like where they say apes together strong. Like this demonstrates how the reactionaries banded together to fight the organized working class. And as for the theory and understanding of this, yeah, we can go to the next slide. That was coined by Georgy Dimitrov, who was an organizer that was targeted by the Nazis. He was put on trial and defended himself in Nazi court. That's because in the early 20th century, worker parties were organizing towards a transformation of the capitalist economy. There was rampant poverty, economic crisis among the imperialist nations, and the labor movement sought for fairness with their employers. Fascism was created as a reaction to these movements and sought they needed support to crack down on the communist parties. Now, yeah, we can see in a quote from Dimitrov, in the next slide, that fascism in power is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. We can see that the reaction to fearing labor organizing was it was used to wield support from government authorities. This allows the capitalists to maintain control and exploitation over their labor forces who were gaining power when they were banding together. And next, we just have a quick video that'll give a little bit more of an understanding.
Communism odds because you were raised a fascist.
I hate communism.
Of course you hate communism odds because you were raised a fascist.
So yeah, that was just a quick clip from the Golden Girls. Obviously, you wouldn't like the idea of communism if you held fascist ideals. So let's see what makes up fascism. And I guess I want to hear from the audience. What do we think when we hear fascism? Just you can put it in the chats, or you can unmute your mic if you'd like to. Militarization. Yeah, ideology of cruelty and violence, suppression of people's rights. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, exploitation, lots of repression and violence. Yeah. So as we can see, like a lot of these things, yeah, they are built off of that kind of reaction. They are a kind of force to squash activists or organizers, people who are trying to work for the people. So let's go over these let's go over these features of fascism. So the first feature, oh my gosh, hold on. Yeah. The first feature is a small elite wielding state power. Many of us are familiar with the Marcos family and their political dynasty. We can see the family on the top picture. And the second picture, we can see Emperor Hirohito, and he was welcomed with open arms in Europe. Obviously, during World War II, they were all kind of working together. But we can just see how the small elite is very tight-knit and they're working together. Yeah. Now, as for the second feature, we have a centralized political and economic authority. We have examples, the Nazi Party in the top picture wielding German parliament, and we can also see Mussolini in the bottom picture in Italy. Both parties, they were directing the the politics and the economies of each nation, and they held that from the government. And yeah, lots of a lot of economic issues were a very easy way to keep the people who are in crisis below their where they are. And third, we have it's pretty familiar with what Adine was saying earlier, yeah, especially with the reason why Malaya movement was started, the unrestricted force with the authorities being like judge, jury, and executioner. Judge, jury, and executioner. So many of us are familiar with these headlines of the killings under Duterte's regime, but even violent, authoritative force. Also, with Malaya movements, we are here to stand in resistance against this unrestricted force. And then with the fourth feature, let's see. The fourth is to exterminate basically enemies of the state, no matter how many, no matter how many they are. I'm sure everyone is very aware of the genocidal intents of the Israeli expansions and how even it expands to Islamophobia here in the United States. Now, the fifth feature, we're kind of running through these, but we'll see a lot more examples with regards to the Philippines and the United States later on. The fifth feature is a belief in a superior nation or race. We can see, like, with this example of Hindu extremists calling to kill Muslims, and also with narratives of national rebirth. So, like, make America great again, the Third Reich, and in the Philippines, Bagong Pilipinas, looking for a new superior nation. And the final feature of fascism is a reliance on a fascist mass base of supporters. We can see two examples on the left with, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the January 6th insurrection on the bottom, and on top was something very similar, which was the Beer Hall Putsch, which was led by Hitler and the Nazi Party to overthrow German parliaments. Though both of these insurrections were unsuccessful, it just demonstrates the amount of power that both parties can wield. Like, with these leaders can just inspire these masses to come and try to take over the very systems. Yes. So that was all the features of fascism. And like I said, we kind of ran through them, but with the other facilitators, we will be going over more examples directly with the United States and with the Philippines. And so on the next slide, we just have a quick timeline of fascist leaders throughout history. You should drop in the chat if you can name any of these people. And keep in mind, like, each of these leaders, they rose to power in response to people's movements and worker organizing. You can basically think as the rise of fascism as capitalism holding on for dear life because the people, they're standing up. And so we just see while we see this history of fascist leaders rising, we also know that that is a history of people banding together and fighting for labor, fighting labor movements. Yeah. And thank you very much. That's all from me. I'm going to be passing it to the next facilitator.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? This is Teresa with Malaya San Diego. And yeah, we just went through the 6 features of fascism. And yeah, we'll be, as we continue the study, we'll be seeing how we can see these different features like in real time. But before that, what examples can y'all draw from the US, either recently, a bit further in the past? What are some examples that you can draw? Drop them in the chat and we can read them out loud. Proud Boys overturning Roe versus Wade, yeah, maybe we can get one or two more examples before we can, yeah, talk about more. Project 2025. Yeah, these are good. House bill nonprofit killer, border camps. Wow, these are all spoilers for things that we'll be discussing in the next couple of slides. Just quickly again, U.S. in colonies imposing colonial dictatorships, Reagan, militarized response to encampments, restricting education, time, place, manner crackdown on campus protests, media ownership. Yeah, these are all great examples. And some more examples too that we can think of, right? Recently, I think people have mentioned this in the chat as well, but also the deep repression of the Palestinian movement and solidarity, right? We saw in the past year, but also like, you know, throughout kind of Israel's occupation of Palestine, people have risen up to support the resistance of the Palestinian people. And what happens? They're met with heightening violence and repression, including the outlawing and terror tagging of organizations. Like the top part of the slide, we see that in October, just a month ago, that the US Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned Samidoun, which is the Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, and the Canadian government listed them as a terrorist entity. And I think people have also mentioned time, place, manner rules, and kind of thinking of how there were such militarized crackdowns and responses to college encampments and student support for the Palestinian movement. And people were also putting, Malaya's Instagram getting suspended after the anti-Duterte post, right? So these are some examples pretty recently. And I think a couple of people have also mentioned the nonprofit killer bill, which is going to be after this slide. But also on this slide, we can also see US's unchecked rule over bodies like the United Nations, right? Just a couple of days ago, on the 20th of November, the US vetoed the Security Council resolution on Gaza. And despite having 14 votes in favor of the ceasefire, the US was like, no, we do not want that. And that, you know, it shows here that for a resolution to be adopted, it must secure at least 9 votes and no vetoes from any of the permanent members. So we can really see just kind of, yeah, how the US has these unchecked control over bodies like the United Nations. And later on, we'll see also influence on bodies like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But some people have already said this in the chat, but the nonprofit killer bill here, where basically any US nonprofit can be labeled as terrorist supporting, and that the Treasury Department would be able to revoke the tax exempt status of nonprofits suspected of providing material support to terrorist organizations. So this, you know, just also recently happened, and we can see, right, how this falls under some of the characteristics of fascism, right? Really suppressing the ruling elite's enemies, and really showing that there is a small elite of big capital owning class that wields state power. And here we've got a list of side by side some of the policy recommendations from Project 2025, which Adine mentioned earlier, but also here we can see Project 2017. Project 2025 is not like a new thing that fell from the sky. There were also similar policy recommendations from Project 2017. When, you know, after the first year, the first Trump regime. And not all of these recommendations were adopted wholesale, but 215 out of 334 were implemented in Trump's first year. So you can really see that, you know, that's why it's so important to study history, right? The history of fascism, and also how it changes and develops over time. Because, you know, as somebody once said, history happens twice, first as tragedy and second as farce. And, you know, some of the things we can read here, there's also a link to an article in the chat kind of comparing Project 2017 and Project 2025. But really here we can see militarized responses to border security, really using them to enforce deportations, the kind of like here, the family program that would maintain a biblically based social science reinforced definition of marriage and family, and also in the the consolidation of political and economic authority, abolishing the Federal Reserve to replace with free banking. Later we'll also be talking a bit more about the proposed Department of Government Efficiency in a future section of this study. But just keep your mind, yeah, like keep it in your mind as we go forward. And here, these are some guys. This is Trump's proposed cabinet, and what we can see here really is, as an example, the Treasury Secretary that he proposed is, a Wall Street investor. We can see like these guys as really the faces of this small elite of a big capital owning class. Sorry for the jump scare, guys. And as mentioned earlier, fascism is really, capitalism really holding on for its dear life. They're holding on. But also you can see them coming together and organizing, which is why it's important that studies like this, and like as we're done with this study, really showing that we need to come together and also get organized, because they're organized, so we should be too. But yeah, sorry for the jump scare, showing the small elite of big capital owning class, nightmare golden bachelorette lineup. Oh my gosh. But it's not just Trump, right? That's why, again, it's really important to study these, developments over time, these historical understandings of fascism, because this is not new. This is not something that like, oh, 2025, this is like, new fascism. But we can see that the use of violence has been like ingrained and baked into US administrations like the present one of Biden and Harris, right? You can see here the use of violence in Biden's immigration and border policies, the pushing back against activism and the democratic rights of the people. Yeah, and you can see that it's not just something that is coming from like in the future, but something that's already here. And yeah. And thank you to the correction of the image being last Trump's administration from the last slide. Yeah, these are also some other examples that people have mentioned in the chat as well, such as the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and then thinking about the repealing of affirmative action, except in military academies, and also the anti-transgender and queer legislation. And what these slides, what these examples are really showing is that there is the use of the law to oppress people's rights. And one thing to emphasize is that fascism, can be made legal. So these are examples from, current and past administrations that show how the law can be used to oppress, can and is being used to oppress people's rights. Another example that we have here is the growth of cop cities across the United States. There are at least 80 known projects in the United States of these training and recruitment centers for cops. So there are at least 80 known projects in all states except Wyoming. And here there's a map from the website Is Your Life Better of like the different places where cop cities are being built or developed. And really, as the bottom picture shows, there are charges that filed under Georgia's expansive RICO Act, really an effort to chill the movement and paint one of the most resilient anti-racist environmentalist efforts in history as a criminal enterprise. And really, this shows like the creation of these places that displace people and destroy the environment for training centers that test violence, and violence that has also been tested in places like Palestine, in the Philippines, and then that's like brought back and refined within the borders of the United States. And so this brings us to US fascism by proxy. These are some examples. I think, when Mikey had asked, can you name some of the fascists on the timeline? People had mentioned Pinochet, yeah, as an example of US fascism by proxy, and really showing some of the undemocratic things that the United States has done over time. This is not new. And kind of, there's this like popular image of the United States as this country that not only fights for democracy, but brings democracy to other places. But as you can see, here instead, what we're left with is US influence and intervention on military politics and the economy of places around the world. So we've got Chile, the funding of far-right forces. We've got Indonesia, the US support of the massacre of 500,000 to 1 million trade unionists and Communist Party members, support for the military junta in El Salvador, the US funded, trained, and armed forces in Afghanistan, and more. But wait, there is more. We also have here more examples, right? We have the gifting of military aid and arms to Israel. We've got the US support for military dictatorships in Guatemala. And also especially this was prompted by agrarian reform that threatened the profit of the United Fruit Company. And also we've got in Libya, the overthrowing of the government of Gaddafi, who banned multinational corporations from Libya and also was creating a plan to reduce dependence on the US influenced World Bank and IMF. And these are just some of the many examples, but some of these we can see, right, that fascism was a response to when there are strong people's movements. When there is strong resistance, the fascists double down. When there are threats to the status quo of rich multinational companies like United Fruit Company, the fascists double down. And we can really see in this US fascism by proxy that fascism is a response to people wanting to change things, to change the way things are done. Agrarian reform in Guatemala, or in the banning of multinational companies and the creation of a development bank that would not be dependent on the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And these are just some examples of US fascism by proxy. And one place that we also want to focus on, as Malaya Movement, an organization for human rights, democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines, is, sorry, it was after that slide, is fascism in the Philippines, right? There's a history of colonization by the United States and the continued US intervention and presence of the United States. And, that's why we wanted to show these examples of US fascism by proxy. The next section is going to talk a bit more about the history of fascism in the Philippines. Also wanted to read the chat about a book for anti-fascist lessons right there. So thank you for that link. Yeah, so the next section is going to talk about the history of fascism in the Philippines, and we'll go more deeply into how we can see the manifestations of the 6 features. But before that, we're gonna here's some more plugs. We're gonna take questions in a bit. We're kind of reaching the half point of this study, so percolate, think of questions, drop them in the chat, send them to our questions person, Julie. But before that, yeah, join Malaya Movement. If you find yourself agitated and excited by the things that we're talking about so far, join Malaya. There's a little link there that you can use to fill out our Google form. And also, earlier this year, a bunch of Malaya members were able to visit the Philippines, and on December 7th, there will be a report back of, all the people who were able to go to the immersion trip, and the lessons that they learned on the ground in the Philippines. So register on December 7th at those following times. And as Odin mentioned earlier, yeah, we are, grassroots. We're doing this because we want to resist fascism and know that, know that organizing and coming together is, the way to really lean into people power. So donate to Malaya. Here's the link. And yeah, so now we're gonna take a pause for any questions that y'all may have about kind of this first half where we showed again as a little summary, showed the history of the term fascism as coming from, Mussolini in Italy, and then the 6 features of fascism, and then, some examples more recently, and then so that's kind of like the path so far, and then we'll go into the history of fascism in the Philippines and looking at the features, 6 features with more contemporary examples. So yeah, if there are any questions, now is the time. The floor is yours, and the facilitators and I will answer them. So there's a question. Were there any specific methods or resources y'all utilized in researching for this presentation? I think people had placed also in the chat a link to the Fascist Offensive by Georgy Dmitriev. And then also, yeah, there's also like a primer. Oh, there, perfect. A primer by Prism on fascism. So these are some of the theoretical resources. Thank you, Julie. Julie also listed them in the chat. Sorry, let me scroll down on the chat as well. All right, we got a question of what phase in the fascist process would you consider us to currently be in? And then we've got a response to that question of, I think fascism has always been there. It is tied with global capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism.
Yeah, just to add, in the features of fascism, it's really, we're talking about features. We're not saying that fascism has like its phases, not that wouldn't be accurate. Like what Dr. Ligaya is saying, fascism is an inherent feature of an economic system of capitalism, of imperialism. So we are in fascism, period. is the phase. We are here.
Yeah, thanks, Audine. Yeah, we are here, and we'll be able to look at, we can look at the features of fascism in the next couple of sections where we'll look at more contemporary examples in the U.S. and in the Philippines. And then there's a question. So I'm just gonna read them out loud. Okay, we got 3 more questions. We've got a minute left for this question and answer portion, so maybe we can gather these questions and then like come back to them at the end, unless there's like a particular question that we wanted to answer from these. I'll just read them. Is identifying fighting fascism more defined at the national level? Why use capitalism and fascism as 2 different terms? Do all 6 features need to be present? Fascism, just wondering on how fascism has common shared themes, but also specific to time, conditions, and location.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. These are definitely a lot of questions, and we wouldn't be able to get to all of them in time. But maybe just to answer a couple of them, how has fascism changed society in the Philippines? We'll get into that next part. what was the other one? Why use capitalism and fascism as two different terms if non-fascist capitalism doesn't exist? Well, capitalism is an economic mode of production, and fascism is literally just like the tactics of reaction of people of the masses trying to upend that economic mode of production. So they're not exactly the same thing, although they go hand in hand. So that's an answer to that. Do all features of fascism need to be present to be fascism, or can it be fascism with a few features? Absolutely. Like these features, yeah, not all of it has to be present for sure. For example, we'll go into it, but for example, in the Philippines, there is constant attack on the labor unionists, and like this, like in the universe of attacks against labor unionists, not all features of fascism is present, but definitely naming a specific population as an enemy, which is labor unions, workers slash communist parties, and the unrestricted use of violence. And I think it's, almost instinctive, like that in and of itself is fascist reaction, and it doesn't have to include like the rest of these other features. Okay, and then for folks who, it seems like folks are also like soliciting questions from the audience. So like if the audience has any thing that y'all want to contribute to say, like I think one of these is, what are some different movements and traditions of resistance against fascism that has spoken to you? Please feel free to participate in the chat. But otherwise, sorry, lots of questions. We'll do our best to get to answer them at the end. There's another portion for questions at the end. But yeah, we can move on. I think we can move on to Arthur. I think Arthur will need, there you go, co-host permission. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I had to log on like 5 times. Sorry about that. Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Arthur. I'm an education officer for the New York chapter of the Malaya Movement. I'm based in Woodside, Queens. Want to shout out our watch party in Purple Dough, Filipino-owned business in Woodside. I was just there and just ran home because I was like, it's too loud there. But I will be talking about the history of fascism in the Philippines, and how fascism manifests itself in the world today, particularly in the Philippines and in the US. Next slide. To start, I will be discussing the history of fascism in the Philippines from the 70s and the 80s during the martial law period, when there was a blatantly fascist and tyrannical regime in power in the Philippines. So this is 50 years of fascist history from a country that has a dismal human rights record. So please bear with me. Marcos Sr. first won the Philippine presidency in 1965. And during his campaign for a second term, he borrowed extensively and began tapping foreign loans. The Philippines was in debt, and they asked for help from the IMF, which proposed a debt restructuring deal that led the Philippines to become export-oriented and import-dependent up until today. This began a pattern of loan-funded spending, which the regime would continue until they were deposed, resulting in economic instability that is still being felt today, and debts that are still being paid up until this day. Because of these economic woes, a period of unrest happened in the Philippines in the first quarter of the year 1970. From January to March, a series of political demonstrations, protests, and marches against the administration of Marcos Sr. was organized by students and supported by workers, peasants, and members of the urban poor. They raised issues relating to social problems, authoritarianism, alleged election cheating, and corruption under Marcos Sr. This, along with other watershed events that happened in the Philippines at the time, including the Diliman Commune and a series of bombings in political events, led to the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in 1971. It is important to note that before the writ of habeas corpus was suspended, Marcos had already been expanding the Philippine military during his first term. He served as his own Secretary of Defense amidst the backdrop of the Vietnam War and tapped the military for civilian projects. The series of demonstrations during the first quarter storm was largely met with brutal police repression. Marcos Sr. declared martial law in the Philippines in September of 1972. At the time, a constitutional convention was ongoing to revise the Philippine Constitution at the time, which was heavily patterned after the U.S. Constitution, was partial to U.S. interests. When Marcos declared martial law, 10 delegates to the convention that represented the progressive wing were immediately arrested, and the rest fled to hide. This allowed him to directly influence the new constitution and entrenched his power for the next decade. From 1972 until 1986, when he was finally ousted by a broad people-powered movement, there had been over 70,000 political detainees. Almost half of these, 34,000, had been tortured, and over 3,200 were killed. Most of these political detainees were community organizers and activists. Many were militant youth who were not afraid to demand their rights and for their government to treat them and to regard them as humans with human rights. These numbers are conservative estimates. At the time, virtually all media was gagged, and outside of underground journalists, the only reportage that was happening was heavily influenced and censored by the state. It is important to note that throughout the almost 20 years of Marcos Sr.'s dictatorship, he was supported by 5 U.S. presidents from Johnson to Reagan. 3 of them were Republicans and 2 of them were Democrats. After Marcos Sr. was ousted, there was actually, can we go to the next slide? So after Marcos Sr. was ousted, there was a renewed sense of hope for the return of democracy to the Philippines. Corazon Aquino, the wife of Senator Ninoy Aquino, who was murdered by the Marcos dictatorship, took office. It's important to bear in mind that Corazon Aquino's family, the Cojuangcos, are one of the largest landowners in the Philippines. Mere months into her presidency, a farmers' march protesting the lack of government action on land reform and redistribution was met with violent repression from the Philippine National Police, basically just a rebranding of the Philippine Constabulary under Marcos Sr. 13 died and at least 51 were injured. Throughout her term, this quote-unquote beacon of democracy, 34 journalists were killed. There were also 1,064 extrajudicial killings and 816 desaparecidos. We see here that the return of democracy in the Philippines was really an illusion, and that the culture of impunity and state repression had firmly implanted itself in the halls of the state. After Aquino, the next president was Fidel Ramos. We talked extensively about fascism under Marcos Sr. The truth is, none of that repression would have been possible without the Philippine Constabulary, the national police force at the time, and a police force that was headed by Fidel Ramos. The fact that the person who orchestrated rampant human rights abuses was not only pardoned, but also allowed to run for office and allowed to run for the presidency and appoint and elect other PC officers in his government is a confirmation of this fascist reality in the Philippines. Fast forward a few years, Vice President Gloria Macapagal Aquino stepped up into the presidency after her president, Joseph Estrada, was ousted by another mass movement after allegations of grave corruption. She herself was subject to grave corruption allegations later in her career as well. She is now a congresswoman and was recently the Speaker of the House. Her term was considered one of the most brutal since the martial law era and remained so until Duterte came into power. And throughout her term, there were 1,200 political killings, and the Hacienda Luisita massacre happened, which we just commemorated the 20th anniversary of a couple of weeks ago. Peasant farmers and their solidarity allies were brutally repressed after demanding the land distribution of Hacienda Luisita, and several of them died. The Hacienda owners just happened to be the Cojuangco Aquinos. And the president that followed GMA, Gloria Arroyo, was Noynoy Aquino, the son of Ninoy and Cory. He actually personally called her to drive out the demonstrators from Hacienda Luisita. His term was considered more moderate, a time of economic stability for the Philippines, a return to the democratic values brought in by his mother, Corazon. But the truth is that rampant repression still occurred, mostly against indigenous peoples, peasants, and environmental defenders who opposed international mining projects and defended their land. He also passed RA 10168, also known as the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act of 2012, which we'll come back to later. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. And so now we're in 2016. This brings us to the time of Rodrigo Duterte and his so-called war on drugs. I'm so sorry. I feel like that's been a lot. But don't worry, I'm only like halfway through my section, so there's gonna be a lot more. Duterte ran on a platform of violence. He also openly ran as a fascist candidate, promising to kill tens of thousands of criminals and to eradicate crime in the Philippines within 6 months. He promised that his presidency would be a bloody one. To this day, he is one of the few Filipino presidents that actually kept his promise. Over 30,000 victims of extrajudicial killings occurred throughout his term. Around 450 of them were community, peasant, labor, and environmental organizers. Throughout his 6 years in office, the jails had accumulated tens of thousands of inmates. Almost 600 of them new during his term were political prisoners. And under his regime, incarceration in the Philippines increased by over 70%, making the Philippine incarceration system the third most congested prison system in the world. So how did this happen, right? We can take a look at the whole of nation approach to counterinsurgency that was used during Duterte's term, which was modeled after US pacification efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The whole of nation approach to policing the Philippines is exemplified by the NTF-LCAC, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict. This task force includes several police and military intelligence agencies and secretaries from the Departments of Social Welfare and Development, Finance, Public Works, Information and Communication Technologies, and even Education, right? These are departments, government agencies that are supposed to be ensuring the social welfare of the country. But instead, they're ensuring that every facet of public life can and is monitored, surveilled, and policed, resulting in what is, by all intents and purposes, a police state. This approach is also known as Uplan Kapanatagan, and it is used to repress legal mass movements by red tagging any forms of legal dissent as communist fronts. The same approach to counterterrorism is also used in regular policing. The reason why the previous administration's war on drugs was able to incarcerate such a large number of individuals in such a short period of time was that civilian, political, and community officials were heavily involved in drug enforcement operations, creating an environment of distrust characteristic of a police state. The whole of nation approach also has an international cluster that monitors, surveils, and represses dissent abroad. So every time we have an action outside the Filipino consulate here in New York, we're actually being policed by the NYPD's counterterrorism unit. So if there are any state agents on this call, hi. And to further entrench the culture of state repression in the Philippines, the anti-terror law was passed in the Philippines in 2020. The law makes definitions of terrorism broader and more vague. It criminalizes terroristic intent, which is also subject to abuse as no reliable standard exists to prove one's intent. By the language of the law and how arbitrary it is, being in this Zoom call may constitute terrorist activity if the Philippine state deems it as such. So congratulations. And we come, next slide. Oh my God, he has such an ugly face. I'm so sorry. And we come now to the present under the administration of Marcos Jr. There have been virtually no changes between the policing and counterinsurgency policies of Duterte and Marcos Jr. If anything, there is a direct continuation. There are more enforced disappearances of community organizers and activists, more rampant arbitrary aerial bombings and arbitrary shootings in the countryside, And we mentioned earlier two laws, the ATL passed by Duterte, the anti-terror law, and the terrorism financing prevention and suppression law passed by Noynoy Aquino. These two laws are being used arbitrarily to suppress legal forms of organizing in the Philippines. So these laws have been weaponized against political organizations and even civic society organizations that provide civic aid to underserved populations and organizations that provide disaster aid even sometimes. I'm sure that some of you heard in the news recently that the Philippines has been racked by 6 consecutive typhoons this past month alone. So that's one typhoon for every 5 days, right? Killing dozens of people and damaging tens of thousands of homes and forcing evacuations. Some of these evacuation and rehabilitation programs receive contributions in the form of money and labor from these CSOs that are being labeled as terrorists by the government. A parallel can be made in the way these laws are being weaponized in the Philippines and how they're being used here, like Teresa mentioned earlier. Most recently, we just saw Samedun, a Palestinian prisoner solidarity organization, labeled as a terrorist organization here stateside. Okay, we can go to the next slide, which takes us to fascism today. Next slide. So its features, right? A small elite of the big capital owning class wielding state power. Again, right, this people competition over here. So in the Philippines, there is a culture of political dynasties which hold onto power at every level of government, right? Down from your most basic, barangay tanod up until the president. In fact, every single president in the Philippines since the end of World War II was either born into a political dynasty, married into a political dynasty, or started a political dynasty themselves. Every single one except for Quirino, actually, who instead of joining the political theater in the Philippines, his descendants decided to marry into the European aristocracy instead. So politics is very much a family business, not only in the Philippines, but increasingly here in the US as well. We have seen Trump appoint his family members to government positions and his close allies in his cabinet. Most recently, he proposed, reminiscent very much of the cronyism during Marcos Sr.'s time. Virtually every single person in his cabinet and government were his allies, his friends, his business partners, right? Most recently, he proposed creating a new federal advisory commission called DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, to be headed by Elon Musk, the richest individual in the world, and Vivek Ramaswamy, another billionaire. Next slide. So Musk and Ramaswamy through DOGE have actually proposed cutting $2 trillion from the federal budget and to reduce federal employees by as much as 75%, and to consolidate all federal agencies from more than 400 to less than 100. Of course, that if that's not an extremely centralized political and economic authority, I'm not sure what is. But of course, you can see that really aim to do this to make regulations of their businesses harder, but also to make it much easier to bend the system for the purposes of the elite, right? They aim to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget, but we know that the cuts will be made to social support, social safety nets, right? Programs that benefit underserved people and underserved populations, healthcare. These cuts will not be coming in the form of cutting military or military aid to human rights abusers, right? The regime in the Philippines, it will not come from cutting the budget for the Navy, for the military, or any of that. It will come at the expense of everyday people like us all in this call. And this map it shows the distribution of politician ownership rather, over businesses across the Philippines in 2016. So you can see they own a lot of things, right? So if not some of the regions where it's deeper red, that means they own most of the things. In the regions where it's not as red, they own some of the things, but essentially they have their hands in everything. And next slide. Okay, and unrestricted use of armed or coercive force, disposing of formal democratic processes to impose its aim in order to dot dot dot. Okay, if I don't know if we can do this in this call, but if you can, if you've ever felt scared, when you've seen a police officer on the street, try to raise your hand. I don't know if we can do this right now or if we need like admin privileges, but if you've ever felt, unsafe, seeing like a police officer, armed forces, military, state, whatever you have it, out on the street, out in your community, raise your hand, right? Yeah, it's just because there's this heightened moment of fascism right now where you don't know what could happen to you because the state is backing its security forces wholesale, right? There's an unrestricted use of armed or coercive force, disposing of formal democratic processes to impose its aim in order to, yeah, I for one, when I see a police officer, it gives you the shivers. I want to hide, right? Which is weird because they should be protecting and serving. But essentially, right, you can see here on this this chart the human rights abuses that have occurred in the Philippines from July of 2022 to June of 2024, right? So we can see really it's just a continuation of the policy of the fascist policies of Duterte. And over here, some more examples here stateside and elsewhere in the world, right? So in New York, police arrest 200 people as they clear Hamilton Hall. At Columbia University, if you've seen pictures of that, of SWAT basically forcing their way into Columbia and dragging out these students that were peacefully protesting. Dutch police detained 50 protesters recently. When Maccabi Tel Aviv was in the Netherlands as part of their European League match, why is an Israeli team even in the Europa League? They're not good. But also Trump confirms plans to use the military to assist in mass deportations as well, right? So really, times are scary right now. You don't know, the only thing we know for sure is that the security is really there to protect the capitalist class and the owning class, right? They're not really there to protect the people. Go next. And to suppress and or exterminate at all costs the ruling elite's clearly identified enemies. So who are those enemies, right? Trump has called, so like the original fascists of Europe, the Philippine ruling elite has clearly identified their main enemy as communists, quote unquote. They target progressives critical of the oppressive economic system, whether they are in fact members of the Communist Party or not, right? We've seen like everyday people just putting up food pantries in their neighborhood during the COVID lockdowns. They were labeled as communists simply for wanting to take care of their community, right? So these are also like trade unionists, environmental defenders, indigenous peoples, clergy, journalists, right? In the US, the rise in fascist rhetoric has been directed towards immigrants, queer people, Black and brown communities, the working class, students, who are all lumped under, woke liberals or the radical left, and like, which is it, right? Because those are two very different camps that don't like each other either. But essentially, everyone who is not white, cis, hetero, or Christian is othered in this current political climate. Next slide. And then, yeah, belief in a superior nation or race. This was a headline recently from the New York Times, I think, as came up 21st, like 2 days ago. Yeah. So the white supremacist incidents are rising across the US. Flash demonstrations of hate and white power intended to spread fear and anxiety are happening almost weekly in the US, says experts who track the incidents, right? And in the Philippines, there is rampant prejudice against Muslims and indigenous tribes, which often occurs because of development, right? Multinational corporations are coming to the Philippines, wanting to tap into the rich mineral reserves, wanting to use the land that belong to Muslim communities and indigenous communities. And because of that, they're facing repression from the state, right? These groups have become a scapegoat for the government and ruling elite that develop land, with the Marawi siege as an example. And there's also one more feature that I didn't include here, but that fascism has a mass base. I mean, But we've talked about it throughout the course of this section, right? Trump was recently elected and Duterte was elected by a landslide. So these people came into power through electoral means. That means they were able to rile up a mass base, and they were able to empathize with these people, to promise them, what they wanted, or give them empty promises, right? So they really used the disillusionment of the working class, of the youth, right? Showing them that, the current system we have isn't really working towards them, and trying to influence them to come into a new system, a system of fascism, right? Blaming immigrants, blaming people of color, blaming, quote unquote, unwanted people, immigrants coming into this country, stealing your jobs, right? They use this rhetoric in order to rile up their mass base for them to come into power. And I think that might be it for me. Can we go to the next slide just for me to be sure? Beautiful. I'll pass it back to Odin.
Oh, it's actually Rowan for this section.
Oops, I'll pass it to Rowan.
Thank you, Arthur. So, hello, I'm Rowan from Malaya, Long Beach, and Carson from Southern California. And we just went over the examples of fascism worldwide, currently and historically in the US and the Philippines. And I just wanted to mention that as Malaya Movement, we believe people have the right to exist, have the right to self determination, and when people are under attack, under oppressive forces, they should have their own they should have the right to choose their own course of struggle, whether it's protesting on the streets or waging armed revolution, as we will go over the few examples. And if anyone wants to put in the chat what comes to mind with the term people's resistance, specifically against fascism. Like what comes to mind when we think of this term? Right, power of freedom. Power of freedom, yeah. Yeah, so I agree as well. And like the main idea of this is wherever fascism pops up, wherever fascism pops up, the people always answer, and there will state transformation, there will always be some form of resistance against Filipinos for Palestine. I'll be mentioning that, whether it be legal or illegal, we think about what is considered legal under a fascist government and how the 6 features of fascism comes up again. So we could go to the next slide. So, where there is violent suppression of people's rights and the stamping out of anyone giving criticism against the fascist government, we think of red tagging and the blacklisting of activists, as well as extrajudicial killings. The people resist and fight back. So here's a few examples where this happens. In China and the Philippines, there were resistance fighters that opposed fascist Japan. And in Europe, there were workers disrupting the economy to push back against Nazi Germany. And we can go to the next slide. Yes, and includes resistance against local fascist collaborators. So this means that fascists, as we've reviewed over the course of this presentation, fascism is legal. It is permitted by the state. And we can go to the next slide. So the next few slides will be a few examples contrasting legal and unarmed forms of resistance with illegal armed forces of resistance. Resistance against anti-people, greedy forces that seek to repress any force that disrupts the flow of capital and power that only benefits the small elite that wields state power. So Here is the propaganda movement that was seeking reform, and the armed katipunan against, which were both against the Spanish colonial government that sought for the rights of Filipino people. Next slide. And again, just another contrast in the French underground newspaper and of a French underground newspaper that is an unarmed form of resistance, as well as armed resistance in German occupied France. And we can say we must also observe that there is nuance in a revolutionary struggle. There's nuance in struggle against fascism. So not all people who seek reform, who seek who seek change within legal boundaries are purely pacifists, pacifists, and not all armed fighters have a purely military viewpoint with no regard for, politics or anything. So we can go to the next slide. Here is another example contrasting legal. Oh no, this is there was the legal uprising of students exercising their democratic rights, the first quarter storm, as we've said previously. And exercising their democratic rights to take to the streets, which was then made illegal by the fascist Marcos dictatorship. And hand in hand is the New People's Army in the countryside, where resistance fighters are waging the People's War. The current New People's Army is considered a terrorist organization by the government and media, and most, if not all armed resistance is considered illegal. Let's go to the next slide. And yes, and here is another form of unarmed resistance. There's Polish visual propaganda and resistance fighters that fought against Nazi Germany. And I would like to say that, like, under fascism, fighting for your rights become illegal, as we saw in like the first quarter storm. Therefore, you should resist, and it's important to be critical of like what is considered legal. Like we shouldn't always equate legality to being ethical or what is right. We can go to the next slide. And this is the current boycott, divest and sanctions movement that exists to boycott Israel's genocide on Palestine and Palestinian fighters against Israeli occupation and genocide. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so fast forward from the propaganda movement and the Katipunan, there is the democratic mass movement in the Philippines, exercising their right to take to the streets and demand to end the crisis. This was during the Duterte era, and urging the people to fight for land, wages, jobs, and rights. And the New People's Army that seeks to overthrow the current Philippine government. And we can go to the next slide, which should say, yes, fascism can and has been defeated repeatedly by mass movement. We can go to the next slide. So here are some slides of Filipino protest, calling out the Philippine government's political repression and military terrorism against the people during the Marcos Sr. era. And we could go to the next slide. And this is anti-Marcos pro-people activists in the US. Yes, next slide. And here is the present day Filipino-Palestinian solidarity movement in the Philippines and the US that calls for the liberation of Palestine, as well as building genuine democracy in the Philippines. So, just one more point I'd like to make, that legal and illegal unarmed and armed resistance often work hand in hand to resist. So they often work together to resist a repression, suppression of people's rights. So that is it for me. I'll pass it to Audine.
Yes, thank you, Rowan. So one last thing before we wrap today slash tonight, is going over lessons from the global anti-fascist Filipino movement, or in general, lessons that can be applied, historically already applied in movements, in the ongoing movement against fascism. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. Okay, this is kind of incomplete, but just the point of this slide, on the left is labor leaders, Silme Domingo and Jean Viernes, who were anti-Marcos, anti-dictatorship, anti-martial law activists back in the 80s. Who based in Seattle. So just demonstrating again the international character, the need for international solidarity when it comes to resisting fascism. And on the right is actually present day. I believe this is in let me know, New York people, but this is in New York. Which borough, I'm not sure. But it's just demonstrating that even in same thing with the past and with the present, fascism also more or less uses the same tactics of repression, of smearing pro-people activists, both like here in the United States and in the Philippines. So just starting off with that there's historical lessons here since fascism repeats itself. Go to the next slide. Okay, yes, it's in Woodside, Queens, in Little Manila. So one, same as in the anti-martial law movement in the Philippines, that took on a global scale. Again, the anti-martial law movement was significant also here in the United States with US-based Filipinos as well as allies. Protest actions and the use of culturals, or rather the use of protest art, or art in use of advocacy and activism, and not just art to be art, is something that was employed both then and now. And we see that, of course, we see that today. We see that name an incident or an era, or a year in which there's massive protests on the streets. We currently see that for Palestine. We saw that with the Black Lives Matter movement, so on and so forth. And of course, we see that today with the anti-fascist movement of the Filipino diaspora. On the left, back in the 70s or 80s, I'm forgetting. But part of the protest movement was demanding the cutting of support of the United States government for the Marcos dictatorship. And it's the same vein. This is on the right is a photo of Malaya members in Washington, D.C. in front of the embassy, demanding for a stop to the killings under the drug war. And not just the drug war, the many killings that are many killings targeting activists and organizers in the Philippines. You can go to the next slide. Another tactic that we employed back in the day and also employ now is the use of parliamentary means to achieve some sort of reforms that can affect immediate policy, but much more importantly, that can galvanize a movement of people that is then activated for the long term. On the left, again, Filipinos under the protesting the Marcos dictatorship. And then on the right, Filipinos and non-Filipinos lobbying to end military support for the Philippines by the United States. Go to the next slide. And then coalition building and diverse organizations, diverse characters of organizations employed then and of course now. What this means is, yes, I'm coalition building, so between collaboration and partnership between organizations. But when we say multiplicity of organizations, also just organizations that working with organizations that maybe are not primarily, say, anti-fascist or yes, but organizations that are also moved towards the shared value of genuine democracy, of fighting against state violence, etc. So for example, Malaya Movement has worked with many organizations that want to take action for the Philippines, but are not necessarily founded on taking action against fascism in the Philippines. So within the Malaya Movement Alliance, we even have one of our organizational members is the Association of Filipino Scientists, so scientists that are moved for national democracy in the Philippines. And we work with religious organizations, etc. So really kind of galvanizing multiple organizations of people towards one goal for bigger impact. Go to the next slide. Excuse me. And of course, cannot dispense of solidarity with other struggles for liberation. Back in the day, also another anti-martial law, anti-Marcos Filipinos here in this rally for Jesse Jackson. And on the right, of course, like Malaya being part of building this national Filipinos for Palestine network. And of course, there's so many examples in between. Malaya members and their allies take action for other different liberation struggles, constantly take action with the Black Lives Matter movement, or take action with really like other international struggles that isn't just Filipinos. You can find this in the streets when the United States sends even more money to for war in name a country. We go to the next slide. So those are just some of the tactics that in terms of mass movement that have been used and have resulted in positive gains or impact for specific epochs of fascism in history. And again, it's tactics that we still employ, of course, today, all with the goal of galvanizing as many people as possible to take organized action together. Yeah, so that's pretty much the end of the presentation, but we do want to pose questions for folks here and would love to hear from folks on the chat. And after this, we will have another chance for Q&As. But we do have unanswered questions still, so we'll play it by ear in terms of time, but we will aim to end in like the next 15 minutes. But yes, want to turn to the participants here. In what ways is fascism a reality in your local community? Actually, that's connected to one of the questions that was unanswered. Which historical examples stick out to you, and how do they connect? How do you connect to them now? And actually, I think someone also asked that question in the chat. And of course, why is it important to fight fascism? I know that it sounds obvious or maybe instinctive to us, but we will want to hear from folks like what brought y'all to this study, and what made y'all interested in taking action aside from actually being moved to action. So would love to hear from folks about any of these questions. Again, what ways fascism is manifested locally for y'all? And we have people from San Diego all the way to Florida here. What historical examples stick out? And to you, why is it important to fight fascism?
Letting people unmute themselves. But if you say stuff that we don't like, we'll mute you.
One person has a hand up. I think Brandon does.
Hi y'all, I'm Brandon. I'm with Malaya PDX. Pretty much most of my experiences were formed through the first Trump presidency here in Portland. We saw a pretty significant organization and mobilization of